Welcome to week one's content-oriented video. Each week I'm going to try to provide a brief introduction to the week's topics. It will more point to the topics than develop the topic in full. So these aren't really lectures in the traditional sense. These are more just orientations, focusing on some issues, trying to help you understand what you read, think about the issues you need to be exploring as you're working. That's kind of more how graduate school works. Hopefully this orientation will be a useful one. For the first week of the course, the primary focus is on the history of New Testament interpretation. We're surveying Bray's biblical interpretation, past and present, as a quick overview of history. And so, although it's a little bit older than I would ideally like, it's a solid overall introduction. It's an interesting book. We're going to, in addition to those broader trends, we're going to read the sections on New Testament interpretation in particular. So we're skipping over Old Testament, but try not to get bogged down on the details of all the interpreters. As you get to the end of each section, he gives a list of many interpreters with like a paragraph or a few sentence summary for them. That's more reference work. It's like reading a dictionary. It's not very interesting. So skim through them, kind of get the sense of what kind of material is there. Maybe hit a couple of important key figures, but I really wouldn't try to read most of them. I'd skip many of them. So you want to read about what he says about Irenaeus and Augustine and key figures. But again, don't get bogged down. If you try to read and master every detail here, you'll get lost. That's not the purpose of this. I just want you to get the broad scope of the picture with some of the particulars that are important. And then when you need to, you can open this up and look back. What did that guy say about interpretation? You'll have a little kind of a dictionary of interpreters here in Bray. Let me toss out a couple of things to reflect on as you're reading. First, I want to talk about the variety of historical interpretive approaches. This is more of a macro observation. I mean, this isn't looking at any specific thing, but that doesn't make it any less important. I mean, just this broad, as we look, we're going to see there are a multitude of approaches. What's the significance of this variety? Does this suggest that we ought to embrace a plurality of approaches? Does this cast any doubt on the certainty with which we reach interpretive conclusions using contemporary methods? We live in an age of pluralism today, but that's not a new thing. That's historically the reality. So what do? Why do we privilege? Let's ask this question. Why do we privilege more recent models as opposed to those that were historically closer to the apostles, for example? And we'll talk about that with patristics a bit. At least in a couple of places, Bray seems to succumb to the temptation to describe the history of interpretation as progress, so that we're going from worse interpretations to better. It's kind of this development, progressive kind of theory of history, theory of interpretation. Note Bray's comments, for example, on Thomas and the presumed modernist ideas of progress that are built in there. We've moved into a new age. We've moved into a modern era, he says in page 183. Is the modern era better? He might be right, but that doesn't really demonstrate that post-critical readings are superior to pre-critical ones. For example, that's actually an issue, as we'll see later in the course, of contemporary debate. Just this is an issue to explore and put on your radar early on. We kind of assume there's one right way to interpret texts, but does history raise questions about that? Or how do we respond, if we think that's true, how do we respond to this plurality historically? That's an important issue that we need to think about. Well, let me wander on to some more specific things that reflect on some of Bray's discussion. First, I note in passing, something Bray discusses in the introductory section I didn't require you to read, that there are a lot of theological assumptions we bring to the interpretive task. So when we start interpreting scripture, we don't come with a blank slate. Our mind is filled with ideas. Those include ideas, for example, what we believe about revelation, the nature of inspiration, including then corollaries of authority and inerrancy. Our understanding of the clarity of Scripture, the perspicuity of Scripture, as it's sometimes called. What we think about the canon and more. we can't really develop these background beliefs in this course. We just don't have time. I'm going to assume kind of indigenous standard evangelical assumptions there. But those assumptions profoundly shape some of the things we will conclude later. So be aware. So don't, when people disagree with you, it may be not an issue of reason. It may be an issue of different assumptions. And your assumptions might be right. Our assumptions, I think, are right. But my point is that if you just exchange them for a different set of assumptions, you would end in a quite different place. And that's important to know and be transparent about. These are my assumptions and all of that. Now, some thoughts on the patristic era. And there are lots of interesting things to note about this era. And again, I think for many of us, we're not as familiar with this as we ought to be. And there's been an increasing interest in patristics among evangelical scholars and others over the last few generations. So I'll just note that a lot of recent patristic scholarship has called into question some of the traditional assumptions, some of which are built into Bray's discussion, to be frank. So here we're going to be critical of Bray, or at least raise some questions about Bray's interpretation a bit. For example, traditional discussions contrast the literal Antiochene school, which is up here in this, this section up here, right, with the Alexandrian school down here, which is more allegorical. So if you think of that, literal versus allegorical, these two schools that compete in the early church. But Elizabeth Clark and Robert Wilken and many others who studied the patristics in detail, not just kind of riffing on them in generality, but talking about them in detail, observe that the categories of literal, typological, and allegorical are not really the best way to talk about how these people thought about interpretation. In older interpreters, typology was historical. That's kind of an ancient kind of a Palestinian framework. They didn't think that that was something unusual. Well, allegory was non-historical. Okay, so there's a little typology and allegory, but in our minds, those categories are kind of fuzzy. De Lubac and others have argued that Origen uses much more typology than allegory. And he didn't make the same kind of distinctions we make in the modern era. In fact, it's worth noting, if you look at the history, that this Antiochene and Alexandrian division is not something that appears until a relatively modern era. Even someone like Calvin, who we would often say is he follows that, recovering that Antiochene kind of tradition, he didn't use those categories. He didn't think that way. He used fathers of both approaches and both regions at least. So there are other problems with this. But my point is, if we collapse typology and allegory, which seems to be the current consensus, and maybe they're not as different as we think, then modern assumptions about this are likely wrong. And there's some interesting essays. I may post one that you can read, a journal article from, I think it's Westminster Journal, about this, arguing that this whole Antiochene Alexandrian thing is wrong. It doesn't reflect the facts on the ground. There aren't two distinct schools. There's variety within each approach. There's overlap. People from both areas talk about different things and all that. So that it's much more complicated than this very simplistic rubric we use. So just beware. Don't use that as your overarching framework. If you do, you'll be misunderstanding what's going on. I'm going to give you a specific example just to make this kind of concrete. Gregory of Nyssa, his book, The Life of Moses. Now, it's widely regarded as a spiritual classic. It's a small little book. I came across a copy a few years back and read through it, and it's an example of what we call mystical theology. This is this very practical, spiritual kind of theology. Gregory, you may remember, is revered as one of the figures who helped to formulate the final statement, or at least some of the precise language, for the doctrine of the Trinity. So we're talking unquestioned orthodoxy, someone who comes from more the Antiochene kind of region up there, and yet this work is a shocker for those of us trained in more modern interpretive modes. the way you and I have been trained, I think. Begins with some general statements about the spiritual life and the nature of God. And then book 1 lays out a relatively straightforward reading of Moses' life. So far, so good. In book 2, however, the application of the events of Moses' life to the Christian life takes a turn that is surprising. There are so many examples that I could bore you to death with them, right? But let me just share a couple, and that will, I think, make the point. On the birth of Moses, here's what Gregory says. The narrative is to be understood according to its real intention. For the material and passionate disposition to which human nature is carried when it falls is the female form of life, whose birth is favored by the tyrant. The austerity and intensity of virtue is the male birth, which is hostile to the tyrant and suspected of insurrection against his rule. So what do we learn from Pharaoh killing the boys and preserving the females? This is about the contrast between human passions and virtue. It's a little hard to get that in a traditional kind of evangelical reading of the text. But there's more. The burning bush. From the burning bush, from this we learn also the mystery of the Virgin. The light of divinity which through the birth shone from her into human life did not consume the burning bush, even as the flower of her virginity was not withered by giving birth. So the fact that the burning bush doesn't burn up teaches us something about why Mary's body didn't burn up, having the incarnate Son in her womb. Again, a little surprising, I think. The transformation of the right hand, this is again Moses and Aaron, right? The right hand and the rods changing into a snake became the first of the miracles. These seem to me to signify in a figure the mystery of the Lord's incarnation, a manifestation of deity to men which affects the death of the tyrant and sets free those under his power. So Moses and his right arm and the rod which turns into a snake, this is about the incarnation and redemption from the power of death and sin. Moses meeting with Aaron. One might substitute a moral teaching for the literal sequence. By the way, notice that language, right? We think literal is better. It's not clear that Gregory thinks that, at least exclusively. In this way, those who've been striving toward virtue may find aid in living the virtuous life. The events dropping from the literal account, require dropping from the literal account anything written which is foreign to the sequence of elevated understanding. We pass over this on the grounds that it is useless and unprofitable to our purpose, so as not to interrupt the guidance to virtue at such points. In other words, there's this literal account, sure, there's all this stuff going on, but when we're trying to get the real meaning, this moral teaching from it, we can disregard anything that doesn't fit that. Again, this is a little different in how we read it. Here's another specific example. We're going to move on from Gregory. Jewish and Christian interpreters differed into whether to understand prophetic texts, the Old Testament prophetic texts, as historical about what happened in the older era, right, in the ancient world, in the era of Israel in the past, or to be more futurist. The Christians tended toward the spiritual future interpretation. That is, the Old Testament pointed to Christ, right? There's a spiritual sense, more than just what happened historically. It has to point forward. That's the real meaning. But it was a difference in how they understood those prophetic promises, right? Not really an allegorical versus historical kind of way of reading the Old Testament. Did they point to Christ or not? The Christ event, the history of Christ, the Christians read the Old Testament in light of Christ, and so they read it differently. They read it spiritually, if you will. Wilkins says it this way. Paradoxically, in the language of early Christian exegesis, the spiritual sense, that is, the sense which points forward to Christ, this prophetic spiritual sense, was the historical sense. Both groups read the text in light of their own experience and historical position. So Jews read it disregarding Jesus because he's not. They think they're Messiah. Christians read it thinking that it is their Messiah. These are two different readings, but it's really improper to view them as being one literal and one allegorical. And interestingly, you can make a similar argument about these so-called Antiochene and Alexandrian schools. They're rooted perhaps in different accounts of Christology and different ways to respond to things like the Arian crisis. Again, the other studies have suggested that it's not really the way we often have been taught. Contemporary scholars seem to more now be moving toward a focus on understanding how figurative readings function for the two schools or the two groups or different approaches, rather than classifying them in these two schools. Now, every once in a while, Bray says something that gives hints at elements of this. If you read carefully, right, if you read when he talks about interpretive methods, you'll see they're not as clear-cut as all that. But he takes it all back when he criticizes allegory. So on the one hand, he recognizes there's some nuance, but he barrels full bore in with allegory as bad, and progress is good, and grammatical historical is good. Now again, he might be right on that, but these are assumptions, and ones which are, at least to some extent, inconsistent with what we see in the patristic period. We'll take on some of this more in the discussions along the way. I'm just trying to make your life complicated and add new difficulties to this. Okay, so what else could I say about the Antiochene school? If there was an Antiochene school, I'm not even sure you can classify all the people in the Antioch region as in the Antiochene school. But let me just point out some of the points they made that we might find unhelpful. Most of them argued that the Psalms were not Christological. None of the Psalms are Christological. This doesn't sound like a very Christian reading of the text, at least the way we would read it today. They reject, in fact, any kind of Christological interpretation of the Old Testament. It was history, not prophecy. And again, this goes back to the way they dealt with certain Christological issues, a theological bias that really shaped the way they did this. And in fact, some of these Antiochene fathers that get highlighted as having this more literal interpretation had an unorthodox Christology. There were several that were condemned in councils for their Christology, Nestorius and others. So my point is that we shouldn't paint the Antiochene school as the good guys and the Alexandrian guys as the bad guys. That's just not how it actually played out in the early church. You can also notice, for example, if you go to Augustine's book on Christian doctrine, which you really should all read. It's about doctrine, but it's a lot about interpretation. And Augustine, interestingly, does not affirm, for example, a single meaning of the text, at least not in the way we would talk about it. Because he says, for example, at one point he says, any reading of the text is legitimate as long as it doesn't contradict anything we find in the rest of biblical text. That is, he seems to be a much more fluid kind of thing. If you read the way he interprets the creation account, for example, in books 11 through 13, I think it is, in the Confessions, you'll see that as well. So he has his own kind of allegorical-ish kind of, what we would call allegoric, perhaps, kind of interpretation of biblical text. This raises questions for us, right? With our modern focus, our modern explanations, can we account for what happens in the early patristic readings? Let me just say a couple other things about the patristic period and how they viewed the Old Testament in particular. In the early patristic period, some have argued you can see different periods, different stages. The early patristic period, the early church fathers knew the Old Testament very well. I mean, that was the Bible they had initially, right, for many of them, as the New Testament was still being collected. There's a kind of a middle period, second generation, where it seems as though they don't know the Old Testament as well. Many of them seem to be using testimony collections or collections of verses rather than actually being familiar with the Old Testament context. And then in the third generation, as time progresses, more training and time passes, there's more direct knowledge of the Old Testament context. So as we read the patristic period, when we think about how they use the Old Testament, we have to realize sometimes they didn't, depending on who they were and where they were and their training and background, they didn't always have the strongest understanding of the Old Testament, which could skew sometimes their interpretation of the Old Testament as well as the New. Now let's move on more quickly to the rest of the history. I spent a lot of time on the patristics just because it's so fascinating to me. let's talk a little bit about medieval interpretation. A couple things that are important. I'll just highlight these very quickly. The Lectio Divina is really important. This is a spiritual reading of the text, became very important as far as a devotional practice within the medieval church. It involved kind of these four stages. You read it, Lectia, you meditate, you speak it, you read it out loud, repeat it over and over again. Much more oral cultures than our printed press world. And then you contemplate it and you integrate it into your life. So there's been an attempt by many in the more modern era to recover this mode of reading the text, but notice there's no exegetical steps here. There's no methodology of interpreting. You read it, you meditate on it. How is God speaking to me as you kind of repeat it out loud and contemplate that and transform your life based on that. So it's a spiritual reading, but not an exegetical reading, if I can make that distinction. It's very important in the Middle Ages. The other thing that's important in the Middle Ages is the threefold, or more often the fourfold, sense of Scripture. And this is one example of it. I just tried to pull out something that would at least make some sense of this. There's the literal, the tropological, the allegorical, and the anagogical. They said you could read the Scripture in all four of these ways simultaneously. Again, no single meaning. There's multiple ways to read this text. So when we talk about the city of Jerusalem, for example, literally it's the city of Jerusalem. Duh. That doesn't have a lot of meaning. But tropologically, morally, maybe it speaks of the human soul, they would argue. Allegorically, Jerusalem now is the church, right? Because the church functions in the way Jerusalem did, as the people of God. And then Jerusalem also points to the heavenly city. So it's eschatological, right? So when they read the Bible and they see a reference to Jerusalem, historical, yeah, boring, uninteresting, doesn't change my life. But if it's about the human soul, well, now I've got practical. If it's about the church, again, it relates to our life here and our experience today. And if it points to heaven, then it gives me something to look forward to. Those are more practical and relevant meanings than the pure literal one. So this became the common, this fourfold meaning, really important in, the early church. And so you need to be kind of aware of this. I'm going to just note in passing, this is a freebie, it has nothing to do with the medieval period, but when I did my dissertation research on James Brooks, who was an early American dispensationalist, and again, we think of dispensationalism being kind of a literal hermeneutic, Brooks, I argued in my dissertation, I found it in his writings, seemed to have some sort of a multi-tier hermeneutic that shared some characteristics of this pattern. So there was the literal sense, but there's always a spiritual sense. How is it practical to us? And there's always a Christological sense. All Scripture points to Christ. And I think he came to that kind of reasoning, that kind of approach, for some of the same reasons the medievalists did. That is, Scripture is supposed to be about Christ. That's what he shows his disciples in Luke 24, right? Scripture is supposed to be practical. It's written for our correction, right? That's what the New Testament says. So for those things to be true, it can't just be history, right? We have to figure out how to move beyond that. And there are different ways to do that, but it's interesting that in the medieval period, they had a very clear pattern that seems to us perhaps a bit problematic, and that kind of thinking has bubbled up in different places throughout time. I want to note one other thing in the medieval period. Bray claims that Wycliffe, who was the morning star of the Reformation, is one of those guys who begins to push towards a more literal interpretation. I don't think he really makes that argument. In fact, if you actually read what Wycliffe does, he's quite inconsistent. He's still medieval. He reads the Bible this way. He's rejecting church authority over Scripture. But I don't think he's advocating what we would call a modern grammatical historical reading of the text. Similarly, in even late in the medieval period, you got John of Ragusa, again, in page 155, I think. Bray talks about how he argues that Scripture has many senses, of which one, the literal, is one. Again, notice, he's writing quite late in the medieval period. You still have this multiple senses. And notice the second quotation I have here. The fathers are to be preferred to the moderns as interpreters. In other words, he doesn't have a belief in progress. he thinks those closest to the apostles in the early church have the strongest claim to be good interpreters of Scripture. So it's not clear to me that these late medievalists have really turned a corner, or that instead perhaps we want them to have turned a corner so they can justify what we do, and we cherry pick some selective statements rather than see how they actually implement them. So I don't think we get, in the medieval period anywhere, Wycliffe or John of Ragusa and others, I don't really think we see a shift to grammatical historical interpretation as we define it in any robust or clear way. Perhaps I'm wrong about that, but you can evaluate that. A couple quick things about the Reformation and Renaissance. One of the things is that, as Bray notes, all interpreters had kind of a shared belief that we don't interpret Scripture apart from our theological contexts. So here's what Bray says. At the same time, interpreters of this age almost all believed the Bible has to be read within a theological context. Whether this context was imposed from without, that's the Catholic theology, or discovered within the text, the Protestant view. The underlying approach, method, right? It's the same. So both interpret Scripture theologically, which is very interesting because, again, we often tend to act as though if we could rid ourselves of all these theological presuppositions, we could find the truth. And at least in the Reformation and Renaissance period, there's no sense that people think that. And that's not how people did it even in the early church. Irenaeus, in responding to the Arians in the early church and other church fathers, in responding to heretics, appealed consistently to the rule of faith, the canon, this measuring stick of the right interpretation of Scripture that governs how we read Scripture. You can cherry pick a text and make it say something different, but we have this theological consensus that provides boundaries for our interpretation. And we do that as well, even though we often don't admit it. Another issue in the Reformation period that arose was this question of sola scriptura. Now, here's what I'm just going to throw out some things to think of. What did the Reformers really mean by this? How was it implemented? And how did it change, and has it changed since then? So I think in the early church, if you read Calvin, for example, who would be an advocate of sola scriptura, Calvin quotes the Fathers extensively. He adopts beliefs from tradition as long as they don't contradict the teaching of Scripture. His concern, and Luther's concern, were largely teachings which they felt contradicted Scripture that have arisen within the tradition. We have to get rid of those, but traditional beliefs that are consistent with Scripture, even if they're not explicitly taught in Scripture, are fine. So it wasn't solo scriptura, as some people have called it, or nuda scriptura, Scripture only or Scripture without any assistance. It was always Scripture, again, within this theological context. So again, we have to kind of think about what that means for some of contemporary debates about issues along the way. I want to throw that out. I'm going to move forward. Let's talk about Scripture as self-interpreting. Again, something that arises, at least in principle, out of kind of the Reformation area. How does this work in practice? If Scripture is really self-interpreting, why have Christians fragmented in so many interpretive traditions, or at least theological traditions, even those who share the same interpretive rules, right? We all are doing all evangelicals are doing historical grammatical interpretation, but we disagree on not every doctrine, core ones not, but there are many doctrines on which we have a variety of opinions that are all orthodox. If Scripture is self-interpreting, how does that really work given what we actually see on the ground? What's the role of allegory in this self-interpreting model? It was still used, in fact, by many of some sort of allegorical interpretation was still used by many of the reformers along the way. So what's going on here? It's not quite clear what we do. What do we do with unclear passages? So here's where we appeal to the rule of faith for places like how we understand parts of the Old Testament, how we understand Revelation, how we deal with matters of controversy. Christian Smith wrote kind of a fascinating, challenging book called The Bible Made Impossible a few years ago, who argued that it's really impossible to read the Bible like that, and that pervasive interpretive pluralism, that is, in fact, we reach much different conclusions on the same text, means we aren't reading the Bible plainly. So Bray, his one response to this, and this is Bray's response, I think appeals to a large measure of agreement among the reformers. So the reformers agreed on the big picture, even though they disagreed on lots of these outlying minor kind of issues. But it's interesting, the examples he uses, most of the examples he uses, at least I think, are also beliefs held by Catholics. So, we appeal to, the creeds and the core orthodox doctrines of Christianity, but those are not distinctions that Protestants have versus Catholics by and large. So it seems here, we've kind of twisted this argument on our head. Calvin, for example, defends using non-biblical language, which comes from tradition, because the substance is from the Bible. So we can use it, but it doesn't have to be directly from the Bible. But that means we're back to this theological framework. Perhaps all we're saying is our beliefs, our interpretations are compatible with the Bible and grounded in the Christian tradition in some way. But that's a much different claim than saying Scripture is self-interpreting in the strongest sense. We'll come back to this in week 2 a bit more along the way. One other passing note. On the text of the Old Testament, somewhere along the way, Bray talks about that. There are some significant problems in the Old Testament text, Book of Jeremiah and others we can't get into here, but just to realize textual criticism is not just a New Testament problem, it's also an Old Testament problem, and that's part of the self-interpreting problem too. You have to have the text right before you can interpret it. So there's work, academic, scholarly work that needs to be done before we get to the self-interpreting text. Two other things from the medieval period I'll just mention quickly. As scholasticism rises, it becomes a very rigid, organized, very logical approach to Scripture and its interpretation. There's all kinds of implications from that. Many of them are at least spiritually unhealthy, and I think ecclesiastically unhealthy. And then there's the rise also in the post-Reformation era of covenant theology. So we'll talk some, I think, later on about dispensationalism as an interpretive school as well. But it's interesting, oftentimes dispensationalism is criticized for rising late because as a system it arose in the 1800s, and I think that's probably a valid observation. But it's worth noting covenant theology didn't rise, at least in a full form, until probably the 1600s. So it's no long-standing 2,000-year tradition either. These are both attempts to make sense of the larger story of Scripture theologically. And it's not just about chronology here, right? So anyway, but this arises in the Reformation period. In the modern era, I'm not going to say a lot just because we'll be talking about a number of those relevant issues. In the New Testament, you have a bunch of things going, the rise of historical criticism and all that. Obviously, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, the issues are quite different from the New Testament. There's different historical questions, linguistic questions, all that sorts of things. In the Old Testament, the documentary hypothesis, the origin of the Pentateuch, and all that. In the New Testament, it's things like textual criticism, because there are so many documents, manuscripts, the literary dependence and historicity of the Gospels, the dating of books, based on assumption of things like that, and all those sorts of things. But those are those kind of the broad New Testament issues. The last three things here are the things I think that are most important. The rise of grammatical historical interpretation, which is the model I think most of us embrace as our primary mode of interpretation. That's a fairly modern phenomenon. It's just worth noting that. It's a fairly radical historicizing of the text. What it meant frequently became more important than what it means, and that's a problem for a Christian reading of the text. Interestingly, that was paralleled by some approaches to biblical theology that we will discuss in a few weeks. So, in more recent times, the various forms of literary criticism become especially important in New Testament studies. We'll begin looking at them next week and the weeks to follow. In addition, thirdly, we have new background materials. The Dead Sea Scrolls and Gnostic texts provide additional historical background that have led to the reevaluation of the history of the New Testament, as well as to new debates, such as, for example, the New Pauline perspective, which arises out of some of this material. All this is to say that this is a dynamic field there's a lot going on in the modern era, but we'll be focusing more on that in subsequent weeks. So we're going to kind of skip over most of that for the. Let me just talk about what's in chapters 11 through 13, Bray, which I didn't include in reading because we're going to cover a lot of this in subsequent weeks. And really because his discussion is no longer quite contemporary. In chapter 11, he covers academic approaches. He calls those literary criticism, canonical criticism. We'll talk about them. In chapter 12, social approaches, which includes things like liberation theology, feminist approaches. Again, we'll be looking at some of them. And recent evangelical interpretation in chapter 13, with special discussions of divergences that exist within the broad international movement. His observation and opinion on those issues are certainly interesting. I think I would argue that his most important observation in chapter 13 is the divergence, the scale of which I suppose is disputed a bit, between systematic theologies and their strong defense of what I'd call an ICBI approach to biblical inerrancy, International Council of Biblical Inerrancy, the Chicago Statement and all that. Maybe we can talk about that later. And the actual practice of interpretation by many evangelical scholars. This is especially noteworthy in groups like the Tyndale Fellowship and the Institute for Biblical Research, IBR, which have a different focus than ETS despite a significant overlap in membership. The point is that there's ongoing debates within evangelicalism on what this ought to look like. And so being aware of that divergence and that diversity is important for understanding what you read and putting your research in proper position. I've droned on way too long. Let me just make a couple quick notes about the course for this week. You have an online presentation to get ready and a residency presentation. You need to start working on those, doing the necessary research to do them well. Again, you're going to be presenting, you're going to be the expert on the topic you're talking about. So do what you can to be the expert. You know, find a few sources and all that kind of stuff. You have to choose topics, and the course describes that in eCampus in weeks 2 and 3. Some of you may already have gotten to that. I don't know, that often gets snagged very quickly. There's a lot of reading, so keep up on it. You're reading for a particular kind of comprehension, as I mentioned before. There won't be meticulous tests on the content. You know, I'm not going to ask you what happened on page 37, but you need to be aware of the key features of the various topics under discussion and be able to engage them thoughtfully in the discussions and in your projects along the way. And you should, even this first week, begin thinking about your final course project so you can begin to focus your thinking and even your supplemental reading on related topics. I'm a big believer in efficiency. So if you know what your final project is going to be, you can begin to do your supplementary reading and some of your textbook reading even in areas that will help prepare you for that. That's just being wise steward of your time, because you'll have to do more than that to do them well. So anyway, this is a lot, way too long. I probably should have broken this into 2. I probably will do this in future weeks. Thanks for persevering. Obviously, anytime you want, you can hit the pause button and come back to this later, or you can come back and review. Have a great week. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Looking forward to working with you over the next few weeks. Bye-bye now.